George Lucas was right. And the proof isn't in what he said. It's in what Disney did to Rey. You've probably felt it. That hollow sensation watching the sequel trilogy, knowing something was deeply wrong, but struggling to articulate exactly what. Not just with the legacy characters, though we'll get to Luke, Han, and Leia, but with Rey herself, the protagonist, the supposed heart of this new trilogy. Here's what happened, and why it was inevitable. Rey's identity changed between every single film. Not evolved, changed, rewritten, contradicted. In The Force Awakens, her parentage was a mystery box deliberately left unopened. In The Last Jedi, she was nobody. Her parents were ordinary people who abandoned her. In The Rise of Skywalker, she was Emperor Palpatine's granddaughter, descended from the most powerful Sith Lord in galactic history. That's not character development. That's 3 different characters wearing the same face. @Ridley, who portrayed Rey across all 3 films, revealed the extent of this chaos in a 2023 interview with Rolling Stone. Her words are striking in their detachment. What was interesting about the last one, for me, was that you can be a hero and not come from anywhere, or you can be a hero and come from literally the worst person in the universe. You're not your parents, you're not your grandparents, you're not your bloodline, and you're not the generations before you. Read that again. The actor playing the protagonist describes discovering her character's fundamental identity in the 3rd film as interesting. Not, this was always the plan. Not, we built toward this. Interesting. Like she was watching it happen to someone else. Ridley acknowledged both versions of her character with notable pragmatism. I do love the version of, you can be anyone you want to be. But I also love the version where you can rectify wrongs and can't help what you're born into. 2 versions. 2 completely incompatible thematic statements. 1 character. And the actor herself treats them as equally valid alternatives rather than a coherent journey. This happened because there was no plan. The evidence is overwhelming. Let's walk through it systematically. In May 2021, J.J. Abrams sat down for an interview with Collider. He was promoting the 10th anniversary of Super 8, but the conversation drifted to Star Wars, to the trilogy he'd started, left, and then returned to finish. Abrams made a statement that should have made headlines. Having a plan, I have learned, in some cases the hard way, is the most critical thing, because otherwise you don't know what you're setting up. You don't know what to emphasize, because if you don't know the inevitable of the story, you're just as good as your last sequence or effect or joke or whatever. But you want to be leading to something inevitable. The director of episodes 7 and 9 admitted publicly that he learned the hard way that planning is critical. He learned this from the sequel trilogy, the trilogy where nobody planned who Rey actually was. At the 2016 Tribeca Film Festival, during a director's series discussion with comedian Chris Rock, Abrams was asked directly who Rey's parents were. His response was explicit. So I can't possibly in this moment tell you who they are. This is all I will say. It's something that Rey thinks about too. Abrams further clarified that the character's mother and father were not featured in The Force Awakens. He didn't know. Or he knew something different from what ended up on screen. Either way, the protagonist's identity was undefined when the first film released in December 2015. In April 2018, Simon Pegg, actor, friend of Abrams, and someone with inside knowledge of early production discussions, revealed what Abrams had originally envisioned. In an interview promoting Ready Player One, Pegg stated, "JJ had a much different plan for Rey's parentage. I know what JJ kind of intended, or at least what was being chucked around. I think that's kind of been undone slightly by the last one. There was some talk of a relevant lineage for her. Undone slightly. That's diplomatic language." What Pegg was describing was Rian Johnson receiving Abrams' intentions, conceptual directions suggesting Rey had a relevant lineage, and choosing to ignore them entirely. Johnson made his choice explicit. In an interview with Empire magazine, he stated directly, "The perception of these films is that they're all planned out on a secret sheet of paper in advance, but that's just not the case. I wasn't given an outline of where it goes, or even a list of things to hit. It really was just, okay, what's next? Just, okay, what's next? No roadmap, no locked destination, no agreement about who the protagonist was or would become. When asked whether he was required to include specific plot points or provide an ending that would lead into Episode 9, Johnson's answer was unambiguous. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. No requirements, no outline, no guidance on who the protagonist fundamentally was. Johnson elaborated further with the New York Times. His words describe a reactive creative process that doomed any hope of character consistency. I had figured there would be a big map on the wall with the whole story laid out, and it was not that at all. I was basically given the script for Episode 7. I got to watch dailies of what JJ was doing, and it was like, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? That was the creative direction for Rey's middle chapter. Figure it out yourself. So Johnson figured it out. He decided Rey's parents were nobody. He decided her obsession with her lineage was the thing holding her back. He decided the answer to who is Rey was, it doesn't matter where you come from. This was a complete and deliberate rejection of whatever relevant lineage Abrams had been chucking around. And Johnson had every right to make that choice. Nobody told him not to. Nobody gave him a locked narrative to follow. He stated his intention explicitly. I wanted this to be a satisfying experience unto itself. I didn't want it to end with a ... question mark. The Last Jedi functions as a complete thematic statement. Rey is nobody. Bloodline doesn't determine destiny. Let the past die. These ideas work within the film Johnson made. The problem is that his film wasn't standalone. It was the middle chapter of someone else's story, and his thematic conclusions contradicted what came before and would be directly reversed by what came after. Then Abrams returned. He found himself in what he described as a completely unknown scenario. He characterized the situation as one where their movie was not just following what Johnson had started, it was also following what they had started and then had been advanced by someone else. Advanced by someone else. That's the whole problem in 7 words. Abrams set up mysteries about Rey. Johnson answered them in ways Abrams never intended. Abrams came back and had to either accept Johnson's answers or reverse them. He reversed them. Rey Nobody became Rey Palpatine. The entire thematic point of The Last Jedi, that heroism isn't genetic, that anyone can rise, was undone. Now Rey's power had an explanation. She was powerful because her grandfather was the most powerful Sith Lord in history. Her struggle to find identity was resolved by discovering she came from darkness, but chose light. This is the opposite of what Johnson wrote. And neither version was what Abrams originally intended. But the institutional failure goes deeper than dueling directors. It started at the top. Bob Iger's 2019 memoir, The Ride of a Lifetime, establishes that George Lucas had prepared detailed outlines for episodes 7, 8, and 9 before Disney took creative control. Iger describes receiving them. At some point in the process, George told me that he had completed outlines for 3 new movies. He agreed to send us 3 copies of the outlines, one for me, one for Alan Braverman, and one for Alan Horn, who'd just been hired to run our studio. 3 outlines, a complete plan for the trilogy, a roadmap for who Rey would be and how she would develop. What did Disney do with these outlines? Iger writes, Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out. They bought the plan. Then they contractually protected themselves from following it. What happened next occurred at Skywalker Ranch, Lucas's personal compound in Marin County, California. Present at the meeting, Iger, Lucas, screenwriter Michael Arndt, and Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm. Iger's recollection is brutal. George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that we weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. The man who created Star Wars sat in his own home and watched them discard his plan for its future. His plan that presumably included a coherent identity for the new protagonist. Iger acknowledges the wound. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. He concludes, now, in the first meeting with him about the future of Star Wars, George felt betrayed. Betrayed. The CEO's word. So they rejected Lucas's outlines. What did they replace them with? Kathleen Kennedy's own words reveal the contradiction at the heart of Lucasfilm's approach. In an interview with IO9, she was asked whether the trilogy wasn't cemented around Episode 7, and whether a lack of structure had been beneficial. Her response contains its own refutation. Well, first of all, when we sat down to do The Force Awakens, we spent a great deal of time working out all 3 movies and doing the real deep dive on the previous 6, and talking about that, understanding the nuances and the importance of mythology as they are. That sounds like planning. But then she immediately adds, you say cemented. I don't think anything's ever cemented with Star Wars. It can't be. It's so full of possibility that you don't want to reach to a point where you think you've made a decision. So they planned it. But nothing was ever decided. They did the deep dive. But they didn't cement anything. This isn't creative flexibility. This is corporate doublespeak, for nobody was in charge of Rey's story. Kennedy was offered the opportunity to have J.J. Abrams direct all 3 films. He declined, feeling overwhelmed. In response, she decided to replicate how the original trilogy was produced, different directors with personal visions. What she forgot was that the original trilogy had George Lucas overseeing everything. The sequel trilogy had no George Lucas. It had different directors, different visions, and 0 connective tissue for its protagonist. The production timeline reveals the chaos in practice. Colin Trevorrow was announced as Episode 9 director in August 2015, while Rian Johnson was simultaneously being brought on to write and direct Episode 8. Trevorrow wrote multiple drafts, eventually leaked as the Duel of the Fates script, that bore little resemblance to what Abrams ultimately filmed. Trevorrow was fired in September 2017, described as resulting from creative differences, 3 months before The Last Jedi even released. Think about what that means. The director of Episode 9 was fired before the general public had seen Episode 8. The person who was supposed to conclude Rey's story was removed before anyone knew how the middle chapter would land with audiences. Then Abrams was brought back roughly 1 month before The Last Jedi premiered. That means Abrams had approximately 2 years to write and produce Episode 9, without knowing what Johnson's film contained until it was nearly complete. By the time Abrams could assess what Johnson had done to Rey, production timelines were already locked. And whatever Trevorrow had envisioned for Rey in his version, discarded entirely. Abrams didn't build on Trevorrow's work. He started from scratch. Again. Each director started from scratch. Each director invented their own answers about who Rey was. Each director left the next one scrambling. And the evidence of this chaos is visible in every aspect of Rey's story, including her abilities. Consider what Rey accomplishes in The Force Awakens. She pilots the Millennium Falcon through the wreckage of a Star Destroyer on Jakku, executing maneuvers that stun Han Solo himself. She resists Kylo Ren's mind probe, something we've never seen any character do on screen. She then reverses the probe, reading his mind instead. She performs a successful Jedi mind trick on a stormtrooper, despite having learned about the Force approximately 12 hours earlier. She defeats Kylo Ren in lightsaber combat, a trained Force user who studied under both Luke Skywalker and Supreme Leader Snoke. The film presents these abilities without explanation. Rey is powerful. That's the text. Why is she powerful? That's the mystery box. The Last Jedi doesn't answer this question. It reframes it. Rey's parents being nobodies means her power comes from the Force itself, choosing to balance against the darkness rising in Kylo Ren. It's not about lineage, it's about cosmic equilibrium. Johnson even introduces a Force connection between Rey and Kylo, linking them across the galaxy, letting them see and even touch each other through the Force. This bond has no precedent in previous films. It's new, and it's specific to Johnson's thematic concerns about connection, isolation, and the duality of light and dark. The Rise of Skywalker then retcons the explanation entirely. Rey is powerful because she's Palpatine's granddaughter. The Force bond between Rey and Kylo? Now it's a dyad in the Force, a prophesied connection that occurs once in a generation, granting them combined power greater than either alone. This concept is presented as ancient and significant, yet it was never mentioned in the previous two films. It's a third explanation for abilities that already had two incompatible explanations. Rey's powers have three different sources across three films: mysterious destiny in Episode 7, cosmic balance in Episode 8, dark lineage in Episode 9. The films cannot agree on why the protagonist is special, because nobody decided before they started writing. Compare this to Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy. His abilities develop systematically. In A New Hope, he makes one Force-guided shot, after Obi-Wan trains him aboard the Falcon, and after R2-D2 assists his targeting. In The Empire Strikes Back, after intensive training with Yoda on Dagobah, he can move his lightsaber with the Force, but fails to lift his X-Wing. He faces Vader and loses decisively, his hand severed, his confidence shattered. In Return of the Jedi, after more off-screen training, he finally defeats Vader in combat. His abilities earned across three films: incremental, costly, planned. Rey's journey lacks this structure because nobody planned what she was earning or why she could earn it. But Rey isn't the only casualty. The legacy characters, Luke, Han, and Leia, weren't just sidelined. They were actively dismantled to serve a protagonist whose identity kept changing. Start with Luke Skywalker. Mark Hamill told Rian Johnson directly during production of The Last Jedi, "I pretty much fundamentally disagree with every choice you've made for this character." This wasn't diplomatic hedging. It was the actor confronting the director about a fundamental break in character continuity. In a December 2017 interview, Hamill elaborated on his initial resistance. "I've had trouble accepting what he saw for Luke. But again, I have to say, having seen the movie, I was wrong." He added, "I said to him, I totally disagree with what you think about Luke." Hamill identified the core contradiction himself. He questioned publicly, what could have happened to this guy that he would wind up the most hopeful, optimistic guy, now this bitter old cynic? The most hopeful, optimistic guy. That's who Luke was in the original trilogy. The hero who saw good in Darth Vader when everyone, Obi-Wan, Yoda, the rebellion, had given up. The Jedi who threw away his lightsaber rather than strike his father in anger. The man who redeemed the second most powerful Sith Lord in history through compassion alone. That Luke became a failure hiding on an island. A bitter hermit who attempted to murder his sleeping nephew because he sensed darkness in him. A man who wanted the Jedi to end. This Luke existed because Rey needed someone to train her, and Johnson wanted that training to be about failure and disillusionment. Hamill famously coined the term Jake Skywalker to describe this version of the character, a label fans adopted as shorthand for the perceived assassination of Luke's core identity. On December 27, 2017, Hamill publicly walked back his criticism via Twitter, posting to more than 2.2 million followers. "I regret voicing my doubts, insecurities in public." He credited Rian Johnson with making an all-time great film, and noted that creative differences usually remain private. But the original criticism stands in the public record. Even the actor who embodied Luke Skywalker for 4 decades couldn't reconcile the hopeful hero of Return of the Jedi with the cynical hermit of The Last Jedi. Han Solo fared no better. Everything Han built between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, erased. His marriage to Leia failed off-screen. His role as a rebellion general abandoned. His identity as something more than a scoundrel undone. He regressed to smuggling. He became a deadbeat father whose son worshipped Darth Vader. He lost everything that his original trilogy arc earned him. Harrison Ford wanted Han to die in Return of the Jedi back in 1983. George Lucas rejected the request. In a 2010 interview with critic Peter Travers, Ford explained Lucas's reasoning. George didn't think there was any future in dead Han toys. Ford pushed for Han's death for approximately 30 years. In an Entertainment Weekly Q&A around the Force Awakens release, he stated, "I think it's a fitting use of the character. I've been arguing for Han Solo to die for about 30 years, not because I was tired of him or because he's boring, but his sacrifice for the other characters would lend gravitas and emotional weight." Disney gave Ford what he wanted. Han died on Starkiller Base in December 2015, stabbed by his own son while Rey watched from above. But here's the structural problem. Han's death wasn't sacrifice. It was failure. He didn't die saving the galaxy. He didn't die completing a mission. He died failing to save his son. Ben Solo walked away, fully committed to the dark side. Han's death achieved nothing within the narrative except establishing Kylo Ren's villainy. And because there was no plan for the trilogy, nobody could know that Kylo would be redeemed anyway in Episode 9, making Han's death doubly meaningless. He died failing to turn his son. His son turned anyway, 2 films later, for reasons unconnected to Han's sacrifice. If someone had planned the trilogy, Han's death could have been the seed of Kylo's eventual redemption. Instead, it's just tragedy without payoff. A character reset to smuggler and killed by his own child because Rey needed to witness darkness. Then there's Leia. Princess Leia Organa, General of the Resistance, the heart of the rebellion, one of cinema's most iconic heroes. Across the sequel trilogy, Leia was systematically sidelined. In The Force Awakens, she appears primarily to worry about Han and to send Rey to find Luke. In The Last Jedi, she's incapacitated for much of the film after surviving being blown into space, a controversial scene that divided audiences. Carrie Fisher died in late 2016, between the completion of The Last Jedi's filming and its theatrical release. She was 60 years old. Her death forced the Rise of Skywalker into impossible creative constraints. Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy acknowledged the impact. Obviously, with Carrie having passed away, it shook everybody. We pretty much started over. The Rise of Skywalker included Leia using repurposed footage from The Force Awakens. The results are visible on screen. Leia's dialogue is sparse, her interactions limited, her presence constrained by what footage existed rather than what the story required. Leia dies in the film, sacrificing herself to reach her son through the Force, helping trigger Kylo Ren's redemption. But this death was improvisation, not design. It was Lucasfilm doing their best with footage that wasn't meant for this purpose, telling a story that couldn't be the story they originally intended. If someone had planned the trilogy, Leia's arc could have been built from the beginning, with Carrie Fisher's involvement at its center. Instead, the lack of planning meant that when tragedy struck, there was no completed performance to fall back on, no locked footage from Episode 9 that had already captured Leia's intended conclusion. Real-world tragedy collided with structural chaos, and the result was a patchwork farewell to one of cinema's greatest characters. Every victory from Return of the Jedi erased. The Empire returned as the First Order. The New Republic was destroyed off-screen by Starkiller Base in a single scene. Luke's Jedi Academy was destroyed before Rey ever arrived. Han and Leia separated. The galaxy reset to plucky rebels versus evil Empire, as if the original trilogy accomplished nothing. The biggest failure of this trilogy is that we never got to watch our heroes, Luke, Leia, and Han, finish what they started. They didn't finish. They were reset to failure and killed one by one, sacrificed to serve a protagonist whose identity nobody had decided. But wait, wasn't there some other priority at play? Some agenda beyond storytelling? Yes, briefly. One line. There were clearly priorities other than story driving some decisions at Lucasfilm. And now we move on. Because that's not the structural diagnosis. The structural diagnosis is simpler and more damning. Nobody decided who Rey was before they started filming her story. Abrams had gut instincts about directions. Johnson had freedom to ignore those instincts. Trevorrow wrote drafts that were discarded. Abrams returned and reversed everything Johnson established. Kennedy insisted nothing was ever cemented. Character arcs require planning. The hero's transformation from one state to another requires knowing the beginning, middle, and end before you start writing. You can't have Rey learn anything meaningful if each film's writer decides independently what she needs to learn. You can't have her struggle feel earned if each film's writer independently decides what she's struggling against. The Force Awakens presents Rey as a mystery. She's searching for belonging, identity, her place in the galaxy. The Last Jedi presents Rey as needing to let go. Her obsession with her parents, her need for external validation, must be released. The Rise of Skywalker presents Rey as running from something. Her grandfather's legacy, the darkness in her blood, must be confronted and rejected. These aren't 3 stages of one journey. These are 3 separate starting points for 3 different protagonists. Each film redefines what growth means for Rey. Each film gives her different flaws to overcome. She doesn't have a character arc because character arcs require a beginning, middle, and end to exist before writing begins. There was no plan for Rey, so there was no Rey. Just 3 different characters with the same face and name. And through Rey's absence of self, the legacy characters crumbled too. Luke became bitter to serve Johnson's theme of failure. Han became a deadbeat to serve Abrams' remake of A New Hope. Leia became a background figure because nobody planned her role across 3 films. And when Fisher died, there was nothing to fall back on. The whole trilogy is absence. Absence of plan. Absence of coherent character. Absence of meaning. George Lucas sat at Skywalker Ranch and watched them reject his outlines. He was set to advise on the films, but he stepped away because they departed from his vision. His treatments were bought but never followed. His characters were dismantled. His story was abandoned. The man who created this universe understood that stories require structure, that characters require consistency, that trilogies require plans. Disney bought his plans, then protected themselves contractually from following them, then gave different directors permission to invent different answers to the same questions, then watched as Rey became a different character in each film, then collected the box office receipts while audiences wondered why the new protagonist felt hollow and why the old heroes felt wrong. The character assassination of Rey wasn't a creative failure, it was a structural inevitability. When nobody plans the protagonist's journey, the protagonist has no journey. When nobody coordinates between films, each film contradicts the others. When nobody decides who the hero is, the hero becomes nobody, which is ironic given that nobody was one of Rey's 3 identities. Luke, Han, and Leia deserved better. They deserved a trilogy that honored what they accomplished, rather than erasing it. They deserved to finish what they started. Rey deserved better too. She deserved a coherent identity. She deserved writers who talked to each other. She deserved a plan. Instead, she got chaos. And so did we. George Lucas was right. About all of it. Subscribe for more stories like this.